4 shipyards ran 24 hours a day along the cold gray water of San Francisco Bay. Steel frames the size of city blocks rose from the mudflats of Richmond, California. Sparks from 100 welding arcs fell like rain across the open staging decks below. In November of '42, a cargo hull left the dry dock in exactly 4 days. 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. A record no yard has matched since. Before the war, a single cargo vessel took 230 days to complete. Hull sections arrived at the slipway already finished, welded together in shore sheds first. 747 ships left these 4 yards before the war was done. Newsreel cameras recorded every launch. The flags, the crowds, the bow waves spreading out. What no camera entered was the space below the waterline, inside the finished steel hull. Below the open slipway, the hull closed around the workers like the ribs of a steel cave. 7 decks of sealed compartments ran the length of the ship without windows or daylight. Narrow passages connected boiler rooms, engine spaces, and cargo holds in total darkness. Sound moved strangely in those spaces. Every hammer strike came back as a flattened echo. Temperatures in the lower compartments during active work bent the metal rules left on ledges. Workers entering the bottom sections carried their own light on battery-powered hand lamps. Every steam pipe running through those spaces needed fireproof wrap to meet the war spec. Every boiler casing and every valve housing needed the same material on every surface. The material was asbestos, mined fiber pressed into felt rolls, mixed into wet compound. Raw asbestos felt unrolled from brown paper bales and cut to pipe width on staging planks. Workers pressed wet asbestos compound onto curved boiler surfaces with trowels and bare hands. In engine rooms, asbestos fiber was sprayed under air pressure from hoses on wheeled rigs. 900 tons of this material went into each hull before it ever touched the water. 900 tons meant every surface in the lower hull was covered, wrapped, or coated. The workers who applied this material were called insulators, and they worked at the bottom. Insulators occupied the tightest, lowest, worst ventilated spaces in the entire vessel. Staging platforms stacked from the keel upward sealed off every natural path for moving air. Production schedules allowed no sequential work where parallel work was physically possible. A welder burning a seam 2 meters from an insulator wrapping pipe breathed the same air. Every shift that ended left another layer of white residue on the staging planks below. The spray rigs drove asbestos fiber into every recess, every joint, every gap in the hull. Fiber that entered the air in a sealed hole did not leave until the hull was opened again. Workers on the afternoon shift entered compartments already saturated from the morning run. Visibility fell to 3 meters on active shifts, and workers steered by sound and memory. The orange smear of a welding arc 50 feet away was the only light source in the white air. The white cloud that formed at waist height during spray runs rose slowly on the heat. It filled the compartment from the bilge plates to the overhead beams without settling. Workers emerging from 2-hour insulation runs carried the coat of it on every surface. It lay in the folds of canvas jackets, in the weave of work gloves, in the lace of boots. Each hull required weeks of insulation work across dozens of crews running simultaneously. 12 hulls per month meant 12 times 900 tons of wrapped pipe and sprayed steel. Workers who came off insulation shifts later showed pleural cancer at 17 times the norm. Not 17% above average, 17 times the rate of the general population. That number was seated in the hull in '43 and harvested in clinics 40 years on. Work lamps on steel brackets threw their beams into a white suspended cloud and stopped. The beams did not reach the far bulkheads. They dissolved inside the fiber-filled air. Asbestos fiber is a mineral thread hundreds of times thinner than a single human hair. Individual fibers carry no smell, cause no immediate sensation, and are invisible alone. They became visible only in mass, in the white cloud drifting on heat currents off the pipes. Workers on early shifts called it fog. Workers on night shifts called it snow. In active insulation zones, the fiber concentration in the trapped air reached extreme levels. It exceeded the safety limits of the period not by a margin but by a factor of 100. Visibility inside the working compartments fell to 3 to 5 meters on spray days. Workers navigating the lower decks steered by the sound of tools rather than by sight. The arc of a welding torch 50 feet away appeared as a diffuse orange smear in the haze. Fiber concentration built with each passing hour and had no gauge, no dial, no alarm. Morning fog off the bay entered the open slipway above and stopped at the hull threshold. Below the threshold, the air did not move. It accumulated and thickened through the shift. A fresh crew entering a compartment at noon walked into the residue of the morning crew. What left the spray nozzle at the start of a shift was still suspended at the end of it. At shift change, workers climbed out of the hull into the open air above the slip. Canvas jackets and leather gloves carried a uniform white coat from collar to cuff. Workers shook their jackets at the yard gate and raised secondary clouds at knee height. The powder was still in the fabric when the jackets passed through the front door at home. It remained in the hair and on the skin through the washroom at the end of the shift. Transit bus seats collected white residue from every insulation worker who sat in them. At home, the work clothes went into a wash tub and the agitation lifted fiber into the air. The person doing the washing stood above that release for the full duration of the cycle. 11 women in every 100 who washed those jackets showed lung damage in later years. They had never entered the hull and had never stood near a spray rig or a pipe wrap crew. Their exposure traveled the same route every working day, hull to bus seat to kitchen floor. Against all of this, the yard issued a square of cotton gauze folded and tied at the neck. Cotton gauze has pores several hundred times wider than a single asbestos fiber. The outside of the mask turned black from welding smoke within the first hour of a shift. It blackened from the outside and dampened from the inside and stopped nothing in between. Rows of workers at the pipe runs coughed into the white dust and did not stop working. At the medical station, the cough was categorized as seasonal and the shift continued. The language that named what was happening in those lungs did not exist in any station sign. Welding arcs and insulation spray rigs ran in the same compartment at the same time. The war schedule did not allow the pipe wrap to finish before the welders began their run. Sparks from cutting torches fell through the white cloud and vanished before reaching the deck. A sizzle, a brief glow, then the cloud closed again around the tool and the hands holding it. 2 trades, 2 sources of airborne hazard, 1 sealed space, 1 body of shared air. The human lung processes insults one at a time. It was not designed for simultaneous assault. Asbestos fiber alone lodged in the pleural lining and began a slow mechanical damage. Welding smoke alone carried heavy metal particles that inflamed the bronchial tissue. Together, the two produced a third condition that neither alone reliably caused. Among men who worked both trades, the lung cancer rate ran 92 times the baseline. Not 92% above, 92 times the rate of a non-smoking general worker. For every man expected to develop lung cancer, 92 cases appeared in this group. Most of the workers on the Richmond yards smoked. Cigarettes were standard issue in wartime. Tobacco smoke alone raised lung cancer risk by a measurable but manageable factor. Asbestos exposure alone raised it by a different and larger factor acting independently. When the two combined, the resulting risk was not additive, it was multiplicative. Smoking with asbestos exposure produced a risk calculation that dwarfed either factor alone. Workers inhaled 3 simultaneous streams, fiber, metal smoke, tobacco, for years. Insulation crews rotated from hull to hull as each new keel was laid and opened for work. By the end of a 3-year assignment, a worker had spent thousands of hours in that air. 3 years of shifts accumulated in the pleural tissue the way sediment accumulates in mud. The cotton gauze mask darkened from the outside before the first break of a shift. Inside the mask, moisture from breathing trapped a layer of fine particles against the face. Workers pulled the mask down to wipe sweat from their eyes in the heat of the lower deck. For the 30 seconds the mask was down, the fiber concentration at face height was unchanged. A cough cleared nothing from the lower airways where the fine fibers had already settled. Workers coughing in the lower hull sent new plumes of disturbed residue back into the air. After a shift, the lower hull was silent and the residue covered every horizontal surface. The staging planks, the pipe lagging, the tops of the valve housings, white, undisturbed. When the next crew opened the access hatch, the disturbance resuspended what had settled. Mineral fiber does not dissolve, does not degrade, and does not leave the tissue it enters. The lung has no mechanism for expelling mineral fiber once it has reached the pleura. What arrived in the lower airways in the first week of work was still there in the last. It accumulated shift by shift, hull by hull, year by year, without signal or symptom. The body carrying it went home every evening and showed nothing for the next 30 years. Above the yards, the offices had windows and daylight and the smell of paper and machine oil. Below the yards, the insulation crews worked in sealed air that had not moved since morning. Both spaces existed simultaneously inside the same industrial operation every working day. The distance between them was 3 flights of stairs and 30 years of consequence. British factory inspectors documented fatal lung scarring in asbestos workers in 1906. By 1930, a government health report had established the mechanism and the timeline. The report described progressive lung tissue destruction, its pace, and its endpoint. Insurance actuaries ran the numbers on asbestos workers and adjusted the mortality tables. Their conclusions went into internal ledgers and premium structures, not into public notice. By 1934, the actuarial risk had been quantified and filed and acted upon. The action taken was a pricing adjustment. The information stayed in the filing cabinet. Johns-Manville supplied the majority of asbestos materials to the Kaiser shipyard operation. Inside their medical department, worker examinations had produced a large body of findings. Thousands of workers showed early-stage lung scarring consistent with prolonged fiber contact. Workers with positive findings continued on the job and were not informed of the result. Slag and oxide dust from the welding runs settled beside the asbestos residue on the planks. The two materials mixed on every horizontal surface in the lower hull without separation. Workers breathing that mixture inhaled 2 industrial hazards compounded into a single air. Outside the hull gate, the city of Richmond absorbed what the hull could not contain. White powder on the gate road, on the bus benches, on the steps of rooming houses nearby. On the Richmond yards, the medical station occupied a low wooden building near the north gate. Workers came in coughing and were given aspirin and sent back through the gate. The cough was common enough that it had an unofficial name among the workers themselves. At the medical station, it had an official category: upper respiratory, seasonal, recurrent. No entry in the station register named the white air as the source of what it was treating. Production quotas came from the Maritime Commission and arrived as monthly hull targets. The targets arrived and the station treated coughs and the spray rigs ran the next morning. Asbestosis had a clinical name by 1930 and a body of published evidence by 40. On the Richmond yards in 43, that name was not posted, spoken, or acknowledged. The white air continued to fall on the insulation crews below the offices where it was known. Knowledge in one room and ignorance in another room 3 flights down. That was the system. The system ran on its production schedule and delivered 747 hulls. Pre-dawn fog sat on the Richmond waterfront and the yard gate lights burned through it. 2 columns of workers converged at the checkpoint and merged into one moving line. Canvas jackets, leather gloves, welding hoods carried under the arm. The uniform was shared. Women moved through the gate in the same columns as the men, on the same shift schedule. By 1944, they made up close to 27% of the Richmond workforce. That share translated to more than 40,000 women across the 4 yards. Kaiser sent recruiters to bus depots and church halls across Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. The pitch was steady wages, war work, and childcare running on the yard grounds all day. Kaiser opened the first round-the-clock industrial childcare facilities in American history. They occupied purpose-built structures inside the yard perimeter on both shift rotations. The union contract set identical pay rates for women and men on the same job classification. Recruiters posted notices in laundromats and grocery stores across the East Bay corridor. Buses brought workers from as far as Oakland and San Jose on the morning rotation. The yards absorbed every available worker the region and the rail lines could deliver. The trades open to women at Richmond included welding, riveting, and insulation application. Insulation application meant the lower compartments, the spray rigs, the pipe wrap stations. Women on insulation crews occupied the same hatches and ladders as the men on every shift. They pressed the same wet compound onto curved pipe with the same trowels and bare hands. Women welders ran their arcs at stations adjacent to active spray operations all shift long. The fiber cloud above the spray rig did not stop at any job classification boundary. 40,000 women entered that air and worked inside it for the length of their contract. Wartime press photographers set up at the welding stations and at the hull plate positions. Their images showed women at the torch, at the rivet gun, at the freshly painted steel. None of those photographs were made in the lower compartments during active insulation runs. The story told in the press was accurate. The story left untold occupied the same building. Women who washed the work clothes at home stood over the wash tub as the fiber lifted off. 11 women in every 100 who laundered those jackets showed lung damage in later years. Their exposure came through the same route as the workers. Fiber to surface to air to lung. The child care facilities closed when the war contracts ended and the workers were let go. The equal pay clause expired with the contract and the women returned to the general market. The fiber in the plural lining of 40,000 women did not expire with the contract. Emancipation in 42 and diagnosis in 85 share one address in Richmond. The distance between them is 42 years and the length of a single pipe in the hull. The shift horn at 6 in the morning crossed the slipways and flattened over the bay. Access hatches along the hull opened from below and figures climbed out into open air. Their jackets and gloves were white from collar to cuff with the residue of 12 hours. The incoming shift was already at the ladder bases, moving in the opposite direction. Morning fog off the bay sat on the gate road and the sodium lamps above it burned orange. At production peak, the 4 Richmond yards ran 90,000 workers at one time. Richmond itself had grown from 23,000 people to over 100,000. New housing blocks rose on the eastern edge of the city and filled within weeks of opening. The bus lines ran at 3 in the morning, and at noon, and at 6, and at midnight. The city's water mains and power grid had been built for a quarter of the wartime population. Everything beyond that capacity ran hot. The clinics, the transit lines, the laundry rooms. What the infrastructure could not absorb, it redistributed into the domestic air of the city. Kaiser recruited African-American workers when most wartime plants kept their gates closed. Trains arrived at Richmond Station from Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma loaded with workers. Inside the yards, the hiring was open. The assignment of trades followed a different pattern. Historian Shirley Ann Wilson Moore documented where those assignments concentrated. African-American workers were placed disproportionately in the insulation trade at the yards. Insulation was the lowest, tightest, worst ventilated work in the entire vessel. It carried the highest subsequent rate of asbestos-related illness of any trade on the yards. Segregation in the assignment of labor produced segregation in the distribution of disease. The hierarchy written into the work order followed the same line as the one outside the gate. At the gate, workers shook their jackets and raised white clouds at knee height on the road. The powder lifted, drifted, and settled on the bus bench slats and the gate road surface. Bus seats from the 6 o'clock run held white residue from the midnight crew before them. The powder entered houses across Richmond in jacket folds, bootlaces, and hair. Rooming house laundry lines ran between buildings, and the jackets hung white in the evening. Wash tubs and shared kitchens held white water by the time the first rinse was wrung out. After the buses cleared the gate road, the white powder settled back onto the road surface. It lay there in the gray morning light with the same stillness as the residue in the hull. The yard produced ships. The city around it produced a geography of future illness. 90,000 workers carried the same white coat home through 90,000 front doors. The shift ended at 6 in the morning. The contact the shift had made did not end with it. Decades later, the Mesothelioma map over Richmond's neighborhoods followed the bus routes. The launch blocks were knocked clear and the hull began to move down the slipway. Steel displaced water and the bow wave spread across the basin in a widening ring. A flag fixed to the stern caught the wind off the bay before the keel found its waterline. Workers on the upper staging watched from above without setting down their tools. The crowd on the dock raised a sound that the bay fog absorbed before it reached the water. 18 yards across the country built 2,710 Liberty ships. In 42, submarines were sinking Allied cargo faster than new hulls could replace it. The supply margin, measured in weeks of fuel and food, was collapsing towards zero by mid-year. Kaiser's yards changed that calculation, and the Atlantic margin began to recover. American yards were delivering more new tonnage every 3 weeks than submarines sank monthly. The war at sea turned on production rates, and the production rates turned on Richmond. 7 Kaiser yards accounted for more than a quarter of all American wartime cargo tonnage. Richmond's 4 yards alone delivered 747 of those hulls. 747 hulls meant 747 separate loads of 900 tons each. That weight left Richmond in the hulls and entered every ocean the war required. Each hull cleared the slip with 900 tons of asbestos-containing material inside. Wrapped pipe runs, sprayed engine room surfaces, compound-coated boiler casings, all intact. Sailors sleeping in the forward berthing compartment slept inside the insulated structure. The fiber was stable when the hull was new and began to shed as the hull aged at sea. A 3-year-old Liberty ship was a different environment than the one that left the slip. Merchant crews who took those ships into service lived below the insulated decks for months. Hull vibration worked the aging pipe lagging loose and returned fiber to the enclosed air. The crews on those ships breathed what the insulation crews had breathed on the slipway. The camera at every launch stood at the dock and pointed at the flag in the crowd. It recorded the bow wave, the commendation, the admiral's handshake on the podium. It did not go below the waterline, and it did not enter the insulated spaces of the hull. The footage became the record, and the record was the ships, not the air that built them. The slipway after a launch stood empty, wet, and scored from the hull that had just left. Salt water covered the keel blocks, and the fog came back across the vacant basin. By the following morning, a new keel was being laid on the same timber supports. Breaking yards cut through those same hulls in the post-war decades with torches. The insulation inside had not changed. It had waited in the steel since the slipway. Workers in the breaking yard inhaled what the installation crews had released in '43. The launch ceremony lasted 20 minutes. The material launched that day had no end date. The war had been over for nearly 20 years when the lung findings began to accumulate. Men who had riveted hull plates in '43 were in their 50s and short of breath. They arrived at hospital chest units across the country in ones and twos, then in groups. The scarring in their lung tissue was bilateral, progressive, and without a clinical name. Physicians seeing the same pattern in multiple patients began comparing notes across cities. A research team in New York assembled a group of 603 insulation workers. They measured lung function, took chest films, and tracked mortality over the following years. Lung cancer deaths in the group ran at 7 times the rate of men their age elsewhere. Mesothelioma appeared at 45 times its rate in the general population of the same age. Mesothelioma was a cancer so rare before the war that most physicians had never seen a case. By the mid-1960s, it was appearing in clusters tied to a single occupational path. That path ran from the spray rig in the lower hull to the pleural lining of the lung. Johns-Manville had supplied the asbestos and had carried the medical evidence for decades. By 1982, 16,000 injured workers had filed claims against the company. The company could not pay 16,000 verdicts and remain a functioning operation. It filed for bankruptcy, the first American company brought down by accumulated lung damage. $2.5 billion was set aside in a settlement fund for Manville claimants. A separate fund of $1.2 billion was established for the Kaiser shipyard workers. 112,000 claims came into that fund from workers and their families. Federal researchers mapped mesothelioma deaths by county across the country in '99. 14 clusters of elevated mortality appeared along the Atlantic, Pacific, and Gulf coasts. Each cluster sat directly over the location of a wartime shipyard, without exception. The disease had drawn its own map over 50 years without any cartographer's assistance. Women who had washed insulation workers' jackets appeared in the cluster data alongside them. They had not entered the hull, and they showed the same pleural findings as those who had. The fiber made no distinction between the hand that applied it and the hand that washed it. The war ended in August of '45 with parades in every city that had launched a ship. The diagnosis arrived in the same cities decades later with no equivalent public occasion. A hull launched in '43 produced a diagnosis in '85 and another in '91. The ships were built on a schedule of days. The cost was collected on a schedule of decades. No ceremony marked the settlement. No public occasion acknowledged the fund or its purpose. Subscribe to American Echoes and step back into the lost streets, forgotten places, and timeless memories of vintage America.